The eyes followed Abigail Dunn down the main street of Copper Creek. They always did. It was a heat so thick you could taste the dust in it, a sun that baked the very soul. Horses stood with their heads low, flicking flies, and the wooden boardwalks seemed to groan under the weight of the air. But the heat from the sun was nothing compared to the heat of those stairs. They came from the women fanning themselves on the porch of Crow's Mercantile, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves, sharp, brittle. Abigail kept her head down, the basket of eggs on her arm feeling heavier with every step. Her bonnet hid her face, but it couldn't hide the flush of shame that burned on her cheeks. She was her father's daughter, they said, strong as an ox, built like an oak. Words meant to sound like compliments, but sharpened into insults. Each one was a stone thrown at her back. A young girl, not even 12, giggled out loud, a sound that cut right through the heavy air. Abigail pretended not to hear it. She just focused on the steps to the store. 1, 2, 3. Jedediah Crow, the owner, was leaning against a post, his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, a nasty little grin playing on his lips. "Careful with them eggs, Abby," he called out, his voice slick with false friendship. "Wouldn't want you to crush 'em by accident." A fresh ripple of laughter followed. It wasn't loud, but it was mean. Abigail pushed open the door to the Mercantile, the cool, dim air inside a small relief. It smelled of flour and salt pork and kerosene. She set her basket on the counter, her hands steady even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "They're fresh," she said, her voice quiet. Crow picked one up, rolling it in his big, meaty hand. He looked at the egg, then at her. "You're your father's daughter, all right," he grumbled, loud enough for the stock boy to hear. "Strong as a mule, I'll give you that. Shame it didn't fall different for you." His words were another twist of the knife. She took the coins he pushed across the counter, her fingers moving quickly, and left without another word. Back out into the blinding sun, back into the furnace of whispers. "Not a man in this county would take her," one woman murmured. "Mercy, what man needs so much to feed?" another added. Abigail's jaw was clenched so tight it ached. She walked past them, her boots kicking up dust that seemed to cling to her like a shroud. She unhitched her mule, and with a practiced move, swung herself into the saddle. She knew they were watching, measuring her strength and calling it a curse, but then she felt another gaze. It was different, not cruel, not judging, just steady, heavy, like a stone. At the far end of the street, leaning against the livery fence, stood Silas McGrath. The town called him the Giant of Copper Creek, but never, ever to his face. He was a mountain of a man, with shoulders that could block a doorway and a beard the color of sun-scorched wheat. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but she could feel them on her. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't whispering. He just watched. And for some reason, that silent, steady gaze unsettled her more than all the hateful whispers combined. It felt like he was seeing something no one else bothered to look for. She urged her mule forward, riding out of town, leaving the noise behind. But she couldn't leave the feeling of that gaze. It followed her all the way home, a question with no words. Her small cabin was tucked away by the creek, a quiet place where the only sounds were the chickens and the wind in the cottonwoods. Her father had been gone a year, and the chores he left behind were the only thing that kept the loneliness at bay. She worked until her muscles screamed, splitting wood, tending the garden, trying to sweat out the shame that had soaked into her skin. That afternoon, as she pulled weeds from between the bean rows, the tears finally came. Hot and silent, they streamed down her face, mixing with the dirt on her hands. The voices from town echoed in her head, a cruel chorus she couldn't shut out. She hated them for it. But mostly, she hated herself for letting it hurt. A rustle by the creek made her jump. It was just old Ezekiel Boonhart, the preacher, heading home with his fishing pole. He was a kind man. his face etched with the gentleness of someone who'd seen too much of life to be cruel. He raised a hand. "Afternoon, Miss Dunn." His voice was a balm. She forced a smile and a wave, and his small kindness was just enough to get her back on her feet. Later, as the sun began to dip, she gathered another basket of eggs to trade with a neighbor. The trail was dusty, the air finally starting to cool. At the crossroads, she saw him. An old man, collapsed in the road, his breathing shallow, his face pale under a layer of dust. Without a second thought, she dropped her basket and ran to him. She lifted his head onto her lap, using her bonnet to shade his face from the last of the sun. He was frail, smelling of hunger and sweat. She poured water from her flask between his cracked lips, her touch gentle. He was too weak to say more than a whispered, "Thanks." She stayed with him, flagging down a passing rider to go for the marshal. Only when she knew he was safe did she get up, brushing the dirt from her dress. She turned back to her basket. The eggs were a mess, a smear of yellow yolk and shattered shells in the grass. She let out a long sigh, but she didn't regret it. A life was worth more than a dozen eggs, but that's not the strangest part. As she stood there looking at the mess, she felt that gaze again. She looked toward the tree line, where the evening shadows were growing long, and there he was, Silas McGrath, sitting on his dark bay horse, as still as a statue carved from the hillside. He had been watching the whole time. He watched her kindness, her sacrifice, her quiet strength. He didn't speak. He just touched the brim of his hat, a slow, deliberate gesture. Then he turned his horse and disappeared back into the hills. Abigail never saw the gesture. She just saw the empty space where he had been. She walked home, her heart a confusing mix of exhaustion and something else, a flicker of defiance. She didn't know she had been seen. She didn't know that her quiet act of kindness had been witnessed by the one man in Copper Creek who understood the value of things that couldn't be bought or sold. That night, she sat on her porch under a sky full of stars. The cruel words from town still echoed in her ears, stinging like nettles. But another image pushed its way through the noise. The image of a giant of a man whose eyes held no mockery. A man who watched, and in his watching, seemed to understand. A lone wolf howled in the distance. The wind shifted, carrying the promise of rain. And on a ridge overlooking her small cabin, Silas McGrath stood, his gaze fixed on the single point of light in the darkness, waiting. He knew storms, and he knew that the biggest ones always broke just before the dawn. The church bell rang on Sunday morning, its iron voice calling the good people of Copper Creek to worship. They came in their finest clothes, the women with their parasols and the men with their polished boots. Abigail walked among them, but not with them, a small island in a sea of judgment. She knew how it would be. The way the conversations would stop when she entered, the way the whispers would start up again the moment she passed. She slipped into a pew at the back of the whitewashed church, hoping to be invisible. The air smelled of beeswax and old hymns. She bowed her head, clutching her prayer book, but the whispers found her anyway. 3 rows ahead, Martha Bell, the self-appointed queen of the town's social circle, turned around. Her smile was as sharp and brittle as spun sugar. "Why, Abigail," she said, her voice just loud enough to carry. "How good of you to come. The Lord's house is for everyone after all." The "after all" was the poison in the honey. A few muffled snickers followed. Abigail's fingers dug into the leather of her book. She felt the eyes on her, felt their pity and their scorn. She looked up and caught the eye of Annie Lee Harper, a young neighbor girl, who gave her a quick, sympathetic smile. It was a tiny kindness, but Abigail held on to it like a lifeline. She sang the hymns, her voice soft but clear, trying to lose herself in the music. But when the service ended and everyone spilled out into the sun-drenched square, The circle closed in again. The women gathered, their fans fluttering like nervous birds. Martha Bell's voice cut through the chatter. "She's a fine worker, no doubt," she said, her eyes flicking to where Abigail stood alone. "But a woman must tend to herself if she wishes to tend a household. There are standards." Something inside Abigail snapped. She walked toward the group, her heart hammering. "I manage my home well enough," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "The garden grows, the hens lay, the roof keeps the rain out." Martha's smile widened, all teeth. "Of course, dear, but a husband isn't one with beans and eggs. He needs a woman who won't break a horse beneath her, nor shame him with her size." The laughter that followed was light and cruel, and it broke something inside Abigail. She couldn't breathe. The faces around her blurred, their judgment a physical weight pressing down on her. She turned and fled, not walking, but striding away from the church, away from the town, into the tall grass of the meadow beyond. Once she was out of sight, the tears she'd been holding back finally broke free. She fell to her knees in the wildflowers, her body shaking with sobs. She cried for her loneliness, for their cruelty, for the strength that they saw as a curse. She cried until she was empty, the sun beating down on her back. When the sobs finally quieted, she lifted her head, her face streaked with dirt and tears. The meadow was peaceful, the wildflowers nodding in the breeze. It was a beauty that didn't judge. That's when she heard it. The soft creak of saddle leather. Her head snapped up. There he was, Silas McGrath, on his bay horse at the edge of the woods. He wasn't hiding. He was just there, watching. He hadn't seen her flee the church, but he was seeing her now, at her most broken, on her knees in the dirt. There was no pity in his eyes, no judgment, just a deep, quiet recognition. It was as if he saw the pain, but also the strength that was underneath it all. She got to her feet slowly, brushing the grass from her skirt, trying to pull together the shattered pieces of her dignity. Her heart was pounding, but it wasn't from fear. It was from something else entirely. Silas didn't speak. He just gave a slow, deliberate tip of his hat. Then he turned his horse and rode back into the hills, leaving her alone with the buzzing of the bees and the echo of his silent presence. She stood there for a long time after he was gone, feeling shaken. Not by their cruelty, but by his quiet, unexpected kindness. The very next day, the town found a new way to test her. A supply wagon for the mercantile got a wheel stuck in a rut right in the middle of the street. A heavy barrel of sugar rolled off and crashed into the dust. Men rushed to lift it, grunting and straining, but it was too heavy. Abigail was walking by with her basket. Without thinking, she set it down and went to help. She put her shoulder to the barrel, dug her heels in, and heaved. The barrel lifted, and with the help of the other men, they got it back onto the wagon. As she stepped back, breathing hard, she heard a man mutter, "Well, she's built for hauling, that's for certain." Jed Crow, watching from his porch, smirked. "Strong as 3 men, Abby," he called out. "Shame no man's looking for that in a wife." The street erupted in laughter. It was louder this time, more public. Abigail froze, the blood rushing to her face. She wanted to scream, to throw his words back in his face, but her tongue felt thick and heavy. She just bent down, gathered her things with trembling hands, and walked away, the sound of their laughter chasing her down the street. That night, she sat by her lantern, staring at her calloused hands. They were strong hands, hands that could fix a fence, tend a garden, and lift a barrel. Why was that something to be ashamed of? Her father's words came back to her, a faint whisper from the past. "Your strength is a gift, Abby. Don't ever let them tell you otherwise." She held on to those words like a prayer, but her sleep was filled with nightmares, laughing faces, pointing fingers, and a giant shadow that loomed over everything. But in the dream, the shadow wasn't menacing. It was watchful, protective. When she woke before dawn, her heart was still pounding, and the memory of a steady, silent gaze lingered in her mind. A week later, at the midweek church gathering, her breaking point finally arrived. Reverend Boonhart was speaking about grace when Martha Bell stood up, clearing her throat with a sound like a hawk. "Reverend," she began, her eyes fixed on Abigail. "Some among us confuse humility with sloth and grace with gluttony. It is our Christian duty to guide them toward improvement, lest they become a burden on us all." A shocked silence fell over the small congregation. Every single person turned to stare at Abigail. The air grew thick, suffocating. She felt the walls of the church closing in. The Reverend shifted on his feet, looking uncomfortable, but he didn't say a word to stop her. And in that moment, something inside Abigail that had been bent for so long refused to break. It hardened. She stood up. The sound of her bench scraping on the wooden floor was like a gunshot in the silent room. "I am not your burden," she said. Her voice trembled, but it was clear and strong. "I labor as hard as any of you. I care for my home. I show kindness where it's needed. If my strength and my body are not enough for your measure, then perhaps it is your measure that is lacking." Gasps rippled through the pews. Martha Bell's mouth fell open. Abigail didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked down the aisle, her head held high, her footsteps echoing on the floorboards. She walked out of the church and into the bright, unforgiving sun, her heart pounding with a terrifying mix of fear and freedom. The whispers followed her out, louder and angrier than ever. But this time, she didn't run. She walked straight into the middle of the street, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with unshed tears. And at the far end of the road, leaning against the fence rail, was Silas McGrath. He'd come to town for supplies. Their eyes met across the dusty street. His expression didn't change, but his gaze was like an anchor, holding her steady when her legs wanted to buckle. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand and tipped his hat. It wasn't a small gesture. It was a statement, a public declaration, silent but powerful enough to drain the venom from the whispers at her back. Abigail's breath hitched. For the first time, the fire in her chest wasn't shame. It was pride, a small, fierce flicker of it. As Silas's hand lingered on the brim of his hat, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Something vast and unstoppable had just been set in motion, and she was standing right in the middle of it. The sun rose over Silas McGrath's ranch, like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He walked the long fence line, his shadow a lonely giant stretching out behind him. His silence was a wall he had built around himself years ago, brick by brick. His hands were known for their strength, but his voice was a forgotten tool. The ranch was all he had left. It was too big for one man. The fences sagged, the cattle strayed, and the bunkhouse was full of ghosts. He worked from before sunrise to after sunset, trying to outrun the silence, but it always caught up to him in the empty rooms of the main house. It was a hunger that work couldn't fill, and lately, that silence had been filled with thoughts of her. Abigail Dunn. He saw her in his mind's eye, standing up in that church, her voice shaking but unbroken. He saw her kneeling in the dirt to help a stranger, her own troubles forgotten. He saw the strength the town called a flaw, and he recognized it for what it was, a fortress. He didn't know how to use words to court a woman. He wouldn't have known where to start. So he used the only language he knew: work, actions. He started leaving things for her. Small, silent offerings. One morning, she found a loose board on her chicken coop had been expertly mended, held in place with nails far bigger than any she owned. Another time, a small sack of premium grain appeared on her porch, the twine tied in a complex knot she'd never seen before. She never saw him. She never heard him. But she knew. It was like feeling a change in the wind, a presence just at the edge of her senses. She'd stand on her porch at dusk, scanning the tree line, a strange mix of fear and hope fluttering in her chest. Of course, a secret in a town like Copper Creek is like a leak in a sieve. The rumors started in Crow's Mercantile, whispered over bolts of calico. "The giant's taken a shine to her," someone would mutter, and the cruel laughter would follow. What's he see in her? A man like Silas could have his pick of any woman in the county. The whispers reached a fever pitch at the annual barn dance. Lanterns cast a warm golden glow, and the sound of fiddles filled the air. Women in bright dresses spun across the floor, their laughter mixing with the stomp of boots. Abigail almost didn't go. She stood at the doorway for a long time, the simple blue dress she'd sewn herself feeling plain and clumsy. She saw Martha Bell's niece whisper to her cousin, their eyes darting to her before they broke into giggles. That was it. She turned to leave, the familiar sting of rejection pushing her back into the night. And then the music faltered. A hush fell over the barn. Silas McGrath had just walked in. He filled the doorway, blocking the moonlight, a mountain come to life. The fiddles started up again, but slower this time, uncertain. Every eye in the place was on him. He moved through the crowd, his spurs chiming softly, his gaze sweeping the room until it found her, cowering by the door. He walked right up to her. He didn't say a word. The entire barn held its breath. Then, slowly, he extended his massive, calloused hand. A collective gasp went through the room. Abigail stared at his hand, then up at his face. She was searching for a trick, for a hint of mockery in his eyes. But there was none. There was only a quiet, steady invitation. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Before she could talk herself out of it, before the fear could win, she placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and surprisingly gentle, completely enveloping her smaller hand. He led her onto the dance floor. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. Their first few steps were clumsy. She was stiff with nerves, he with disuse. But his hand was a firm, steady guide on her back, and soon they found a rhythm. He wasn't a graceful dancer, but he was strong, and he moved her across the floor as if she weighed nothing at all. For the first time in her life, Abigail felt light. The weight of all those stares, all those whispers, seemed to lift and float away. The people around them were still whispering, but it was different now. It was laced with shock, with disbelief, with a grudging respect. No one dared to laugh. When the song ended, the silence that followed was heavy with questions. Silas held her hand for a moment longer until she had her balance. And then, just as silently as he had come, he turned and walked out of the barn, disappearing back into the night. The town was a storm of talk the next day. Martha Bell called it a scandal. Jed Crow said Silas must be desperate. But beneath their loud, angry words, there was a new current of uncertainty. They had seen something they didn't understand, and it scared them. Abigail walked through town with her head held a little higher. At home, she found a brand new axe propped against her woodpile, its handle sanded smooth, its blade honed to a razor's edge. It was Silas's work. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, a question burning in her heart. Why? Why her? What could a woman like her possibly offer a man like him? That evening, as she worked in her garden, she felt that familiar sensation of being watched. She looked up, but saw nothing but the wind in the trees. But she knew he was out there. He wasn't courting her with words or flowers. He was courting her with mended fences and sharpened tools. He was offering her the only things he trusted: labor, steadiness, loyalty. High on the ridges above Copper Creek, the storm clouds were gathering again, not just in the sky but in the hearts of the townspeople. Silas stood on a rise, looking down at the small light of Abigail's cabin. He had made his choice. He had stepped out of the shadows. He knew what was coming. The town would not accept this quietly. They would turn on her, and on him. The question was no longer if he would stand with her, but if he could withstand the storm he had just unleashed. As darkness fell, the first drops of rain began to patter on the dry earth. Abigail stood on her porch, watching the sky. A flicker of lightning illuminated the hills for a split second, and in that flash, she saw him, a giant on horseback, silhouetted against the storm. Then the darkness swallowed him again. A shiver went down her spine, and it wasn't from the cold. It was the feeling of destiny, vast and terrifying and unstoppable, rolling down the mountains, right toward her. The storm broke with a roar. It wasn't just rain, it was a physical assault, a fury unleashed from a black, bruised sky. Abigail huddled in her small cabin, the wind screaming like a banshee, the walls groaning under the pressure. Rain hammered on the roof, a relentless drumming that vibrated through the floorboards. She lit a candle, its small flame dancing wildly in the drafts. Water began to drip, then pour from the ceiling. She scrambled for buckets, her heart pounding in time with the thunder that cracked directly overhead, shaking the very foundations of her home. Then came a sound she had been dreading. A loud, sickening crack of timber. A main support beam in the ceiling splintered, and the roof sagged violently downwards, sending a shower of dust and splinters onto the floor. The wind and rain now had an open door. Abigail stared in horror as the storm poured into her home. Desperate, she threw her shoulder against the sagging wall, trying to brace it, her muscles straining against the impossible weight. Rain and tears streamed down her face, and she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. She was going to be crushed. This was how it ended. Suddenly, the cabin door flew open with a bang that was louder than the thunder. Silas McGrath stood there, framed in the doorway, a figure of myth against the flashing lightning. He was soaked to the bone, his shirt plastered to his massive chest, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity. He didn't waste a second. He strode to the broken beam, pushed her gently but firmly aside, and put his own shoulders to the task. With a grunt that seemed to shake the room, he heaved. The beam, the wall, the entire section of the roof moved upwards. He held it there, his muscles bulging, his feet planted like ancient oaks. "Get back," he growled, his voice a low rumble that cut through the howl of the wind. It was the first time he'd ever given her an order. She scrambled back, watching in awe as he single-handedly held her home together. He was a force of nature, fighting a force of nature. For the next hour, they worked together in the chaotic, flickering light of the candle and the lightning. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. He would point, and she would bring him a plank. He would brace, and she would hammer. It was a dance of survival, more intimate and real than any dance they had shared before. Finally, the worst of the storm passed, leaving behind a steady, drumming rain. The roof was patched, the wall was braced. It was a mess, but it was holding. Abigail leaned against the far wall, exhausted, soaked, and trembling. Silas straightened up, water dripping from his hair, his breath coming in deep, steady clouds in the cool air. The tiny cabin was filled with his presence, with a heat that had nothing to do with the small fire she had managed to keep lit. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the rain. She looked at him, at the man who had appeared from the heart of a storm to save her. The question she'd been holding inside finally spilled out, her voice barely a whisper. "Why? Why do you keep doing this?" He took a step toward her, then another. He didn't answer with words. He reached out and gently brushed a piece of debris from her hair. His touch was so light, so careful, it made her breath catch in her throat. His eyes searched hers, and in their depths she saw an ocean of things he would never say. He was here because he had to be, because something inside him wouldn't let him be anywhere else. The world outside the cabin may have been returning to quiet, but the world inside had been irrevocably changed. In that moment, Abigail felt the last of her shame crack and fall away. She had been told her whole life that she was too much, too big, too strong, too much to feed. But this man, this giant, looked at her and saw not a burden, but an equal. He saw her strength and matched it with his own. The knowledge was terrifying, and it was thrilling. The next day, the town's whispers turned venomous. "It's indecent," Martha Bell declared at the Mercantile. "A man spending the night in her cabin. What must people think?" Jed Crow just laughed. "The giant must be truly desperate to scrape the bottom of the barrel like that." Abigail heard them. She felt the sting of their words, but for the first time she didn't let them pierce her skin. When she walked through town now, she walked with the memory of Silas holding up her roof. She walked with the feeling of his quiet strength beside her. He was never with her, but he was always near, a silent shadow at the edge of town, his presence a shield she could feel even when she couldn't see him. But one morning, the cruelty became too much to bear. She was at the town well, and the women there turned their backs on her, their whispers sharp and loud. "She'll bring him down, you watch," one of them said. "That ranch won't survive a woman like that." Abigail's hands trembled on the rope. She turned to face them, her eyes blazing. "I am not ashamed," she said, her voice ringing with a new and unfamiliar power. The women fell silent, their mouths open in shock. It was the quiet that comes when the world you thought you knew suddenly tilts on its axis. She hauled her water and walked home, her arms aching, but her heart soaring. That night, she sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The storm had passed, both outside and in. It hadn't destroyed her. It had scoured her clean. It had shown her what she was made of. Late that night, she stepped onto her porch. The air was cool and clean, and in the distance, on the hill where she had seen him in the lightning, she saw him again. A massive silhouette against the sea of stars. She didn't shiver this time. She didn't feel fear. She saw him not as a savior or a shadow, but as a choice. His choice to see her, and her choice to be seen. A quiet understanding passed between them, across the dark and silent meadow. Her life was no longer a burden she had to bear alone. A new storm was coming, not of weather, but of change, and it was rolling toward Copper Creek with the unstoppable force of destiny. The day of the harvest festival dawned bright and clear, the autumn sun casting a golden light on the valley. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, a day for the community to come together. But for Abigail, it was just a bigger stage for her daily humiliation. She carried her baskets of prize-winning vegetables to the town square, the weight of them digging into her arms. But heavier still was the weight of the stares and the whispers that followed her every step. "Look at her," a man snickered to his friend, "bringing enough food to feed an army." At the edge of the square, Martha Bell held court, her fan snapping like a whip. "Such a spectacle," she announced to her circle of gossips. "All that effort for a little garden, and dragging it all here herself, as if anyone wants what she has to offer." The circle of women tittered. Abigail's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. She arranged her vegetables on her assigned table, her hands moving with a deliberate calm she did not feel. Later in the day, there was a contest of strength. A massive sack of grain, one that usually took 2 strong men to lift, was placed in the center of the square. Men took turns trying to hoist it, most failing, to the laughter and cheers of the crowd. Abigail watched for a while, and then a quiet resolve settled in her heart. She walked into the center of the square. A hush fell over the crowd, followed by a wave of disbelieving murmurs. "What she thinks she's doing? This ought to be good." She ignored them. She bent her knees, got a firm grip on the sack, and braced herself. With a deep breath, she straightened her legs and back, lifting the impossible weight. She got it onto her shoulder and stood there, staggering slightly, her legs trembling, the crowd's mocking laughter ringing in her ears. Look at her, Jed Crow shouted, his voice dripping with scorn. Like a draft mule dressed in a skirt. The weight was crushing her. Her vision started to swim. She felt tears of frustration and shame burning at the back of her eyes. She was about to collapse, to give them the failure they all expected. Then the laughter stopped. Abruptly, a shadow fell over her. Silas McGrath had stepped into the square. He moved with a slow, deliberate power that silenced every voice. He walked right up to Abigail, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He didn't speak. He just reached out and, with one hand, took the entire weight of the sack from her shoulder, steadying it as if it were a bag of feathers. The silence in the square was now absolute. It was so quiet you could hear the wind rustling the festival banners. Silas held the sack with one hand. With the other he pointed a single thick finger directly at Jed Crow. Then he spoke, and his voice was not a whisper. It was a low, rumbling thunder that rolled across the square, reaching every single person. "You mock her for her strength," he said, his eyes burning into Crow's. "You call her a mule." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "This ranch," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming even more powerful. "The biggest ranch in this valley is failing. It's failing because I don't have enough help. It needs calloused hands. It needs a strong back. It needs a will that doesn't break when things get hard." He took a step toward Abigail, his eyes never leaving the crowd. He set the massive sack of grain down at her feet like an offering. Then he looked at her, his gaze softening for the first time, a look of profound respect in his eyes. He lowered his voice so only she could hear it. "My ranch needs a woman like you, Abigail." But in the dead silence of the square, everyone heard. The words struck the crowd like a physical blow. Martha Bell's fan froze mid-snap. Jed Crow's face went pale, his smirk finally wiped away. It wasn't just a defense, it was a proposal. It was a declaration of value that turned all their insults, all their years of mockery, into dust. Abigail felt the air rush back into her lungs. It was as if she had been underwater for years and had finally broken the surface. She looked at Silas, and then she looked out at the sea of stunned faces, at the people who had tried so hard to grind her down. She didn't have to say a word. Her posture, her lifted chin, the fierce, shining light in her eyes, said it all. Silas held out his hand to her. This time there was no hesitation. She placed her hand in his, and their fingers intertwined. Together, they turned their backs on the festival, on the town, on the silent, gaping crowd. They walked out of the square, parting the sea of people who now looked at her not with scorn, but with a stunned, newfound awe. They walked toward the road that led out of town, toward the vast open lands of Copper Creek Ranch, toward a future they would build with their own two hands. At the edge of town, Abigail glanced back one last time. She saw the faces of her tormentors, their certainty shattered, their cruel laughter silenced forever. For the first time in her life, she felt not just strong, but powerful. As she stepped forward with Silas, the dust of the road rising around them, she knew she was walking away from a life of shame and into a life of purpose. They were two outcasts, a giant of a man and a woman of unbreakable strength, and together, they were more than the whole town put together. They were a force of nature, and their storm was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story of justice and finding strength in unexpected places, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat.